We are live.
Great. Okay. So, just give me 2 seconds with my lighting situation. Sorry about that. Okay. Hello. We'll start now. Hi, welcome to Plus Three. We're a podcast that's digging into issues surrounding psychedelics and policy, science, culture. My name is Brian Pace. I'm a plant evolutionary ecologist or evolutionary biologist. And I've got Dave Nichols with me here. Dave, tell us about yourself.
Hey, I'm Dave Nichols. I'm an underground researcher and moderator for the DMT Nexus community. I try to find the intersection of psychedelic culture, and radical politics, and highlight some of the tension points currently facing different segments of psychedelic communities around the world.
We've also got Dr. Nishay Devanagh with us. Nishay?
Hey, yeah, I've been working in the field for 10 years as of, next year. And I'm a bioethics postdoc at the Case Western Reserve University School of Medicine.
Great. And we've got Brian Norman with Symposia here.
Hey. That's all you get from me.
Right. Got to wait for the rest. So today we're going to be talking about decriminalization, decriminalization of psychedelics and decriminalization of currently scheduled substances generally. When I think about decriminalization, I support it because, well, first of all, fuck the drug war. That's not something we want to see continue into the next generation. It's a racialized project. It's very clear in its history that things were criminalized to criminalize not necessarily plants or chemicals, but certain kinds of people.
I think not necessarily is it hedging a bit. Like the historical record is clear.
Yes.
The making of certain plants and chemicals illegal is directly connected to the prosecution of minorities, whether ethnic minorities or political minorities. So just to get that explicit for those who don't know.
Yes, and I would say even to say it was hedging a bit is hedging a bit, because if we look at the histories, right, exactly as Nishay was just saying, not only do we see a complete lack of any sort of scientific or evidentiary basis for prohibition and criminalization, but we can actually break it down and see that the project of drug criminalization and prohibition has been a project of white supremacy, of misogyny, of imperialism. When we see quotes from people like Ehrlichman, an advisor to Nixon, who was saying, we knew we couldn't make it illegal to be black or against the war, but we knew that we could criminalize the substances. We could associate the hippies with marijuana and the blacks with heroin, and we could use those as pretext to raid their homes and put them on the news. When we see quotes about dope being just as immoral as homosexuality, I think that was a Nixon quote. When we see these notions of the use of substances to criminalize people who were at odds with dominant culture, mainstream society, the projects of progress within industrial capitalism, I think we wind up in a position where I would contend the prohibitionists, the people who are arguing that there should be restrictions or criminal penalties around a lot of these drugs, are really still in a position of not having shown any sort of evidence for their position. And so at this point, I would say there's no real legitimacy underlying prohibition or the drug war, even aside from all of the atrocities we have seen as that policy has been carried out in the real world.
Yeah, there's that the statement I think it was it Carl Sagan, or I'm not exactly sure which person we're talking about, but the old canard that, you know, that which can be asserted without evidence can be dismissed without evidence. Unfortunately, it doesn't work with policy quite like that. But I think, you know, our stance really should be that, you know, we are creating a lot of, there's a resurgence in research in psychedelics, in drugs. We're saying, oh, they actually may have, you know, uses, which it seems like arguing from a pretty weak position when one has to say, you know, in contrary to Schedule 1 laws that say that these things are without medical value, they were classified as extremely dangerous without any science backing it. And yet, you know, groups like MAPS and Hefter and USONA and everybody else who's trying to lead this charge is doing so by spending a lot of money trying to demonstrate scientifically that which never was the standard for criminalizing it in the first place.
Absolutely. They sort of accept the prohibitionist arguments on its face value and then say, oh, well, we're the professionals who have the credentials, who have the expertise, who have the institutional rigor to deal with these really dangerous Schedule 1 compounds. So there's already been that acceptance that these things are, in fact, as dangerous as has been asserted. And I think that puts us into this really slippery slope, where it's almost like suddenly people feel a need to legitimize or justify or defend their use, that we forget the fact that there's nothing that should stand in the way of using these substances. And so suddenly people are scrambling to say, oh, well, this is legitimate because it's spiritual, or this is legitimate because it's therapeutic, or this is legitimate because it's medical. And we can have debates around, is recreation, can we find some weird way to justify recreation as it's recreation, or it's, you know, this has a deeper meaning, or recreation is intrinsic to human beings. And all of those arguments are sort of fine on their own, in my opinion. But I think the thing that gets missed in those arguments is the fact that, frankly, I shouldn't have to justify it. If I want to eat whichever one of these psychedelic compounds I want to eat, there shouldn't be anything differentiating that from if I want to go be a weirdo and you know, eat the lawn clippings that are growing outside of my house, or brew up the shrub that just got a little bit too tall, so I clipped half of it. Now, I wouldn't expect effects from that, and you would be probably pretty legit to classify me as some sort of weirdo for doing that, but we don't start carting people off to jail. And I think losing sight of how legitimacy has been framed around this creates this really interesting tension around specialization and legitimacy, and who ends up holding power and making claims to power in these spaces. And I think we should all kind of remember, we all have the grounds to claim that power of access based on the fact that there's no justification for criminalization.
And just thinking about, because we were talking about something like slavery earlier, where slavery is now, you know, accepted as really messed up and should not have been a thing, and is not something we accept today. But, you know, you wouldn't go about trying to convince people like, oh, well, this particular slave is my friend, and so he shouldn't be working in the fields, or this particular slave is, you know, good at teaching literature to, you know, my buddies. And it's going after the wrong thing. You know, it's cherry picking rather than addressing this root cause of there shouldn't be slavery, period.
Right.
You know, so the decriminalization conversation, I feel like, does need to have that emphasis on there is no justification.
Yeah, and
so
there's kind of a void in who is pushing forward straight decriminalization in the first place. You know, the groups in psychedelics are generally pushing medicalization, and, you know,
we're likely to see some efforts in the future, but I think one of the things about decriminalization that is lacking in today's discourse is that, you know, we have incredibly progressive policies coming out from groups like the Democratic Socialists and Ocasio-Cortez's Green New Deal. There's just really, really progressive, wonderful stuff, but what's absent is any comprehensive drug reform really whatsoever, which is
So maybe this is a good time. Maybe we should just step back and talk about both prohibition as kind of like what history can teach us about how this process has unfolded in the past, and also in more recent terms, what's been going on in Portugal and the follow-up after 10 years and seeing how things are there. So do any of you want to get started on one of those?
Well, I mean, historically, when you think prohibition, you generally have thought alcohol prohibition, and that's viewed as a massive historical mistake by everybody, but yet during that time period is when pretty much everything, starts to become illegal. But alcohol is the one that escapes, because it's used by politicians and people with power and whites, and everything else got kind of swept under the rug. Heroin, cocaine, marijuana, all those they all become prohibited to one degree or another. Alcohol escapes that, and we view that as insane. What were these people thinking? They passed a constitutional amendment to ban alcohol. How crazy was that? And the amount of crime that came out of that.
Well, and if you, on top of that, and we'll probably talk about this more in a future episode, so I just want to kind of hint at it real quick. But like, even in the context of alcohol prohibition, you still see these schemes around medicalization, right? Medicinal whiskey.
It's my favorite.
Right? People getting state sanctioned approval, where suddenly, the same compound is legal because it's being prescribed for a medical reason. And you see the swelling of liquor being held in medical contexts, and the notion that you could come into a hospital or a doctor and get all sorts of prescriptions for supposed ailments that
to emphasize,
these were going to treat. Go ahead, Nisha.
Sorry, just on that point, I think it's important to emphasize that not just anybody could go into a doctor and get a prescription. Like, that ends up certain segments of the population have more access to that loophole. So I just wanted to stress that.
Well, absolutely. Everybody else has to drink the bathtub gin.
Well, not only the government, because people were starting to, oh, sorry, what?
Do go on.
Sorry, I think it froze for a sec.
Strange.
It's in the history of prohibition too. People started going after industrial alcohols, and they started, trying to drink that. And then the government, being the benevolent father that it is, decided to go and poison those alcohols. And so then you have.
They added methanol, specifically methanol, to the industrial supply because they knew it was diverted, and they knew that it would be a deterrent to poison these people.
And thousands of people died. There were deaths because of that.
Totally.
And there's a really ironic, I forget the senator, but when it was repealed, the amendment was repealed, there's this wonderful quote from someone who's saying, let us learn from this moment in history and know that this, the government should never be involved in making these kinds of decisions ever again. And so fast forward to today and all the problems we're dealing with, it's highly ironic that the government at the time, that was the lesson learned from alcohol prohibition.
Yeah.
Now we're about prohibiting vaporizing now. That's the newest thing,
And there's not even good sense of what's going on there, what the actual cause of that is.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there is some takes that seem to think that vitamin E is the culprit.
FDA seems skeptical about some of the vitamin E claims. Was some of what I'd seen?
I mean, I think it's still unfolding. I mean, these are things that medical investigators are going to have to resolve. But it's one of those things where it seems like something could be handled through more appropriate regulation. But the thing is, I've been seeing similar things in the cannabis literature where people are saying throw away all your carts because the black market sources for your cannabis oils may be tainted. But it's one of those interesting things where if you don't directly regulate something, you essentially abdicate regulation to cartels.
And there have been some issues, I know, of the cartridge fillers who are buying, say, gallon or 2 gallon plus quantities and then filling cartridges, finding that their concentrates have been cut with unknown substances when they've given them to their in-house chemists to redistill or to confirm when they were having issues with bizarre smells or things not looking quite right. So these problems of prohibition and criminalization seem to kind of repeat themselves and echo throughout history as folks seem unwilling to learn these lessons or engage with the histories. And I think it's really interesting. Here we are in 2019, and for how long has Portugal kind of stood out as this sane, sensible, reasonable approach that's kind of lit up? It's been this beacon that's just been out there. That how many
2001,
18
how many
years
people have been repeatedly pointing back to them, and it's like all of these politicians and other folks seem to throw their hands up and act like it doesn't exist, or they're clueless at what possible models could be out there. So I think it would be good to unpack a little bit of what's going on over there.
Well, this is the problem when there's a lack of generally lobbying groups who are pushing for a public conversation surrounding complete decriminalization. I mean, you have Elizabeth Warren and you have Bernie Sanders, and together they're pulling something like 40% now, in the polls combined. And these are the most progressive candidates that we've had in forever. And yet the platform is completely devoid of conversations surrounding drugs. It's not there at all.
Buttigieg apparently has some mention of it in his mental health plan, but that's about it's sort of a surprising surprising candidate to be spending any time thinking about it. And it's disappointing to not see other candidates take up that charge. But in some ways, that is ultimately an omission or a missed opportunity of people like us, advocates and people trying to push counter narratives out there. So with regard to Portugal and those models, I think it's important just for context to say that they were driven to decriminalize because at the time in 1999 they had the highest rates of HIV infection in all of the EU. It was a crisis, and so they decriminalized to make sure that they could address the public health matter that it was. And in so they essentially said, we're going to decriminalize all substances. If you are caught with possession, then I think the standard is a 10-day supply. No more than a 10-day supply is this for this to apply. Essentially, it's an administrative infraction. It's not a criminal infraction. And reading about this, what then happens to you is essentially you get put in front of a tribunal, and it's a social worker, a psychiatrist, an attorney walk into a Portuguese bar. But no, I mean, so you're in front of these people, and they have a variety of tools at their disposal, so they can levy a fine. I think it's something like 25 to 150 euro, which is pretty reasonable. I think it's pegged to the minimum wage in those areas. You can face licensure loss. So, if you have certain driving or professional licenses, those can become jeopardized. You can be excluded from zones of the city. They can ban you from foreign travel. They have a whole bunch of tools at their disposal. Obviously, it's a case by case. They can even put you on some form of parole. You can lose your guns. But ultimately, the thing is that they're trying to encourage you to get help, to provide resources for those who want it. That said, these are not compulsory treatment regimes we're talking about. On the other hand, all of these consequences that we just discussed, you could face those consequences, or you could go to treatment. So I don't know. When I think about the models that are out there, it's been out there for 20 years. I like to say Portugal has not fallen off into the Atlantic Ocean.
Yeah, and there's been, a lot of people have wanted Portugal to fail because it doesn't fit with the whole global drug war mentality. And so despite that, and despite having all these researchers watching, looking at the long-term impacts, I just want to stress that the outcomes have been, they stabilized, this is according to a Guardian article, they stabilized their opioid crisis, which was getting out of control. And they saw dramatic drops in problematic drug use, HIV and hepatitis infections, overdose deaths, drug-related crime, and incarceration rates. And those are, so pretty significant statistics across the board. And what the Guardian notes that I think is interesting is it says that this change has held steady, the change in the laws held steady across several successive changes in government, including conservative leaders that would have wanted to roll back towards the drug war. And part of what has led it to stick was a cultural shift that went along with those legal changes. And it says that there was a change in how the culture viewed drugs and addiction. So before they would refer to drug users disparagingly as the equivalent of junkies, and then people started talking, there's more people who use drugs or people with addiction disorders. It was more humanizing. So those two things, the laws changing and then the culture changing, were working hand in hand there.
Yeah, one of my favorite t-shirts that I see around is nice people use drugs.
Yeah.
Sure. Well, everybody uses some form of drugs every day. I think that the cultural shift is, I think we've seen it quite fast that's happening now, and especially a lot of the young people who will come of age in the next handful of years, it'll be very normalized. The language is changing surrounding that. They'll look back at this time period as a bunch of assholes. They had no idea how to interact with drugs at all.
Yeah, an extremely dark time.
Well, and it also depends on how the political system is set up to handle these sorts of issues, and what the political will want, whether or not certain political wills exist. I mean, I grew up in D.C., and the way DC and Congress exist in relation to each other, as far as sort of the lack of home rule and ability to have autonomy over certain things. I mean, DC has had essentially an epidemic HIV rate for extended periods of time, and I haven't looked at the figures super recently, but it was up at or I think above 2% for a while in the early aughts, and at one point, Congress actually, using a rider, basically decided to defund DC's needle exchange programs. Mm-hmm. And so, right, if we compare, like, at the time, there was a clear understanding of the harm that would cause. It was just a lack of interest in caring for those generally poorer, generally blacker and browner people. And so similarly, I think it's really interesting as we're looking at some of the discussion that's going on in the news about Purdue Pharma and who bears the burden for the opiate crisis, and do we have harm reduction approaches going forward, and how do we handle these compounds? What does government managed addiction look like beyond sort of just methadone clinics? And is there a political will, whether among the politicians themselves or among the bases, the people who could go out and agitate and make noise around it, to provide drugs to people? The way that some people break down some of these harm reduction approaches, where all of a sudden you're giving folks drugs, that becomes politicized in ways where we see the long-running notions of racism, of classism, where these people are not like you. These people,
stigma. The drug users are stigmatized and othered, even though every office in the nation has a coffee shop built right in there next to the water cooler. I mean, Starbucks runs a very profitable multinational corporation based on addiction. If you look at their caffeine levels, which they used to publish, they were the most potent out there. I do want to talk a little bit about some of the more recent decriminalization efforts that we touched on briefly in our first pilot episode. But there's since been developments, and there's likely to be more. So we have Denver and their successful decriminalization of psilocybin effort. And then we also have the Oakland decriminalization or decriminalized nature effort that succeeded through different means. And then we've got some coming on a statewide initiative level from my home state of Oregon. So there's a lot going on. Even so, with the decriminalization efforts, Kevin Matthews, who was spearheading the Decriminalize Psilocybin Denver campaign, is putting together efforts to essentially replicate the model elsewhere with their SPORE network. So I just wanted to talk about some of those recent things.
There's also Berkeley is trying to copy the Oakland model as well, and that's underway right now.
Yeah. So, I mean, broadly, I think I want to just mention also that we might want to talk a little bit about this concept of psychedelic exceptionalism, because we talked a lot about decriminalization and harm reduction and the Portuguese model, which we think is a good goal. But I think some other folks would just like to decriminalize just psilocybin so that we could do that. Or I don't know. What do you think?
Well, you just made a point about stigma not very long ago. And I think within psychedelic communities, there's a lot of stigma towards non-psychedelic drug users. I think that the way that people frequently, and obviously not all people and not all the time, but draw lines or value judgments around these drugs are good, those drugs are bad. I think
hard and
a lot of problems. Right. And somebody, I forget who had pointed out, you can have soft use of hard drugs, hard use of soft drugs.
Hard coffee user over here.
I mean, there are people who are trying to legalize psilocybin now who still believe in hard drugs. You know, that there's the hard drugs that are out there that are dirty. There's the scary drugs out there, which seems incredible to me.
Well, and that touches on another distinction that some people in the psychedelic communities, emphasize, which is the natural synthetic distinction. Like my natural psychedelics
arsenic is natural.
My natural psychedelics, ayahuasca, mushrooms, those are okay, but LSD, 2CB, those are bad because they're laboratory made.
Well, it was a successful strategy in Oakland. I mean, decriminalized nature really plays directly to that narrative that natural drugs, it comes from the ground, it can't be bad, that kind of thing. And I mean, I am for these steps in the right direction, but I think it's always important to be clear where we stand about the whole shebang.
And what baggage we bring with us by doing that, right? At the point where we have this notion that somehow natural creatures in a natural environment using naturally occurring compounds are able to work some magic where they put them in a pot, and because it's man-made or synthetic or whatever term you want to use, whatever comes out at the end is unnatural. It's such an interesting sort of conceptual feat. And I think one of the questions, obviously we can break down, if we want to talk about something like cocaine or heroin or so-called hard drugs, we can look at the ecological effects, we can look at the social effects, we can create a whole bunch of metrics and discuss, and I think have important nuanced discussions about what sort of behaviors and social interactions and substances we would like to have in our lives. But also, we're chemical creatures. There are people who get off on drama. There are people who get off on a wide range of emotional experiences. And I think this notion of these drugs are good, these drugs are bad, aside from perhaps having some limited utility in these strategic questions around what can we sell to a public, I think those questions are interesting, but I also think if we're not conscious about the perceptions and conceptualizations we're putting out there around these drugs, we may realize that we paint ourselves, at least with some of these substances, into some really bizarre corners.
Cyanide's natural.
Yeah, arsenic too.
Ricin.
And just, I mean, from an intersectional perspective as well, like I, for one, don't want to get my cause ahead at the expense of other groups and their causes. So, you know, if I have to screw over someone by demonizing them and their lives and what they do, like I'm not really interested in taking that approach and want to rethink, you know, how I'm going about it. So that's an important thing to keep in mind.
Look, I think that you know, if a place can get psilocybin decriminalized, or they can get psychoactive plants decriminalized, it's a great sign overall. You know, I think it's a foreshadowing, you know, of what's about to happen. If you can get psilocybin passed, I think you can kind of get most things passed for decriminalization. Psychedelics are still, I think, to the average person, kind of alien, mysterious.
Well, the reason
weird,
why,
you know, a police officer that I interacted with once, you know, there was mushrooms around, and he was just like, "Ooh, there's chemicals there." He didn't even want to be in the presence because those chemicals were going to somehow fuck his brain up or something like that. It was very bizarre to hear. You know, someone just talk about it that way. So if you can get psychedelics decriminalized, I think the rest is much easier.
Sure, but here's the thing: is that it seems that from what we've gathered, that decriminalizing all drugs and decriminalizing psychedelics, depending on where you are, polls similarly. So in terms of where you put your effort, it could be that if you're going to go the route of decriminalizing one class of substances, I think there's quite a bit of knowledge out there that the drug war is not just like a failure or something, but it's a sham and a crime itself. So yeah, go on. Yeah.
Which is on the point about mushrooms and psilocybin, I just wanted to mention that in the history of like the psychedelic renaissance, it's been stated that the reason that it's revolved around psilocybin and not LSD is because they thought people didn't know what psilocybin was, and LSD had too much baggage. So it was just like choosing the thing that was least likely to trigger people, basically.
And similarly, I think that's one of the reasons we've seen so much discussion around microdosing. Like beyond the notion that, great, you can give it to your coders. Here we finally got the answer to how do we get something that is supposedly good for the production of widgets out of this vast class of drugs that has historically been sort of anti-capitalist, just in the fact that you can't really be a good worker while you're kind of off in the ether.
For 12 to 18 hours.
Right. And so if we look at microdosing and some of the microdosing stuff around decriminalization, there's a lot of really intriguing dynamics, I think. Notably, we've brought up Denver. We discussed some of what had gone on in Denver in the pilot, and it was not so long after that pilot that suddenly there were news articles announcing that a startup was looking to develop tea and coffee infused with microdoses of psilocybin. And this is, aside from the fact that there's generally speaking at this point, a dearth of real, solid, peer-reviewed research into the efficacy of microdosing and into what can actually be expected, and to what degree a lot of these claims about improved well-being or focus or creativity or what have you has actually, whether or not those claims have merit. But here we see businessmen and other folks sort of coming to the table saying, hey, while we're sort of experimenting with this new legal terrain of no real penalties for possession and de-emphasize policing around it, here, start off your day with a little taste of something that should make your day better, but you won't really feel it and you won't really have to consider that you've taken something. And the way that it seems like there's this start of norming or creating a sense of normalcy around the presence of these compounds, particularly the creating of the sense of normalcy of these compounds by people who potentially have an economic incentive to do so, is really interesting. And I suspect we're going to see a lot of that on decriminalized terrain, because it presents at least a modicum of safety where, can I show that these, can you actually prove that these tubs of mushrooms growing in my apartment aren't just for me, that as an adult over 21, this isn't for personal consumption, but is for sale or what have you. And I think that's going to get really interesting.
Yeah, and just along those lines, I just wanted to read a quick quote from, it was a Denver Post article from August 23rd called "Spores of a Psychedelic Mushroom Industry Are Sprouting in Denver After Decriminalization." And the author writes that there may be dozens of people working in psilocybin adjacent businesses, is the term, which I find interesting, around Denver. And they've heard from a handful of would-be entrepreneurs. So far, the easiest people to find or locate are therapists and counselors. And then they've also heard from yoga teachers and practitioners of alternative therapy who want to serve tripping customers or host ceremonies.
Yogawaska.
Yeah.
So I mean, that's of course the unfolding of these decriminalization efforts are happening adjacent to the gig economy. It's like, well, should I do Uber or should I charge my friends for some sketchy thing that now I'm not going to be a high priority for prosecution. I mean, it's very likely that we're going to see Denver and Oakland, it's almost like a legitimization of what was already happening, but of course they're going to be a nexus for therapy as people who have been looking for something out here in flyover country or something. They're going to go to the places where they have some cover and start looking around, and that is essentially a market opportunity that people will be moving into as same as it ever was.
And as you point out,
same as it ever was. Have you ever heard of Coca-Cola?
Right.
No. Who thinks when you think Coca-Cola, do you ever think that's two plants? Nobody thinks that. Coca-Cola, and it's just part of, you just say it without even thinking about it. It's going to be in everything, and people are going to put it in everything. The most ludicrous thing that I've heard about with CBD was it was like a Carl's Jr. burger or something like that. Something totally weird.
CB burger?
CBD burgers, I think that people will dip their toes into microdosing and to put it into every product and gums and coffees and
one of the things
drinks.
I wonder is if we might see something like a Robitussin kind of model from microdosing, because I mean, Robitussin's interesting. Robitussin DN contains dextromorphin, DXM. In large enough quantities, you can have a pretty transcendent experience on cough syrup. But of course, it's dissolved in cough syrup, and you have to be willing to guzzle this awful gunk down.
Or extract from the cough syrup.
Sure,
and that
not to be that guy.
And that's what happened with meth when they made pseudoephedrine illegal over the counter. I believe it basically shut down a lot of the domestic production, which all of that ended up moving to Mexico.
So one of the things that I think is interesting as we're talking about markets and we're talking about decrim effects on markets, right? As long as we're having market discussions, whether Coca-Cola or anyone else, right, we have to sort of question what the motivators are. And in the case of Coca-Cola, we have no question that that's about profit. Generally, when we're talking about markets, what we're talking about is profit. We've certainly seen a lot of profiteering emerging in psychedelic spaces. But I think around decriminalization, as Nishay brought up these questions of psilocybin adjacent industries, or what we might start seeing as more generally psychedelic compound adjacent industries. What are the motivators there? I mean, as we see this notion of therapists and so-called integration coaches, as the integration industry really continues to take off, I mean, I'm aware of at least one integration coach who lists a partial MAPS training as a credential. So what becomes good enough? What are we trying to do with decriminalization measures? What do we want to see? So if we have this notion that drugs should be available to consenting adults, and that there's no real reason to criminalize these things, lock people up, like it seems like at a baseline we want these things to be available. But then the narratives around the legitimacy of use, the notion that I had heard that there was some friction around people maybe wanting to do some sort of a dose in or a dose out, I think in Oakland, where it was this notion of, hey, this measure just went through. As consenting adults, we can do these things. But then apparently there was pushback from certain folks who felt like maybe that would be a bad look, that those weren't the optics they were going for. The reason for decriminalization maybe wasn't necessarily to put that sort of spectacle out there. The concerns of damaging a movement. And again, I think this raises these questions, these tensions around what are we doing here? Who holds power? Who gets to make these decisions? And ultimately, what kind of sanity can we hope for as we try to push for this decrim?
Well, so just real quick about that point, there was an analog with cannabis, with city gathered smokeouts. Sometimes at the time where it was switching over to legal, people would like take a collective puff at the same time, and that didn't really affect the larger play out of how cannabis has been changing. So the idea that there's somebody deciding that optic is not acceptable and that people need to behave in a certain way to be
respectability
to the masses and the media is bizarre.
Yeah.
And I'd imagine if you had a hand in some of these measures, you might feel protective about it. Sorry, Brian.
Well, so I actually just wanted to do a little clarification for our listeners here that we haven't really talked about the decriminalized nature for Oakland, what it actually is, because it's actually quite different than what happened, both in how it happened and what actually it means. So Oakland, and it seems like Berkeley may soon follow suit. Essentially, they were able to successfully lobby their Oakland City Council members to vote on this decriminalization effort that included all or a wide variety of natural sources of psychedelics. So we're talking all in one fell swoop: peyote, San Pedro, psilocybin, ibogaine. So all of these different substances, and ibogaine is quite a potent substance. In fact, all of them are in the correct dosage. So one of the things that I'm certain will result from this is that we're going to see more domestic production of all of these substances coming out of places like Oakland and Berkeley. And so, at least with regard to how the black market's going to function, you're going to see a literal growth in the availability of these plants.
Yeah, I'm curious on how the supply, how the demands will go once the laws are opened up a little bit. How many more people will engage? With cannabis, I don't know if the amount of young people using it actually increased. I was under the impression that it was a lot of older people who kind of felt it, it was, who might have been scared of using it or whatever, and now they can use it for pain or relaxation or whatever they're using it for. I'm not quite sure of those numbers, so, but I'm curious if, if you decriminalize LSD, how many more people are going to be using it?
Yeah, so I mean, I do know a little bit about what the trend is. Generally speaking, so this is true for Amsterdam, and it seems like this is also true for some of the numbers coming out of Colorado, which is that when you decriminalize something, you also make it sort of less cool, and you tend to make it a little harder to get. So your dealer named Mudflap can sell to a 14-year-old a bag of weed. But if there's a dispensary down the street that's carding somebody, that's a different deal. And besides, that's just what makes Dad's Den smell weird. So it changes the context.
Yeah, it's not a young cultural fuck you anymore.
Yeah.
As it, weed was just several years ago. It still was.
Right.
And it's just rapidly you start to think Apple-looking stores now, or CBD products in CVS now.
Oh yeah, in the grocery store.
Yeah.
I just wanted to say, the late great Dale Pendell had a bit of advice about cannabis. He says, when you're young, maybe a little less often, but when you're older, maybe say yes a little more often.
Sure, that's good advice.
Well, so maybe we'll see those shifts. Oh, go on.
No, I think it'll be interesting to see what the demographics look like. I think there's also, if we consider drug tourism or shamanic tourism, there are questions about how many folks who have maybe wanted to try these things but wouldn't have brewed their own or wouldn't have grown their own, or maybe felt or weren't able to travel to a country where these things are legal or have cultural, historical use, things of that nature. It will be interesting to see what the dynamics do around that, because I don't think it's necessarily as straightforward, might not be the right term, but quite as straightforward as cannabis. And it's one of those areas where I think the psychedelic exceptionalism sort of comes back in around some of that, not so much as like a self-defined, oh, these drugs are better, but rather that there are different dynamics around some of these preparations and some of these compounds. And I think we see it also in the way that some folks talk about this in these burgeoning marketplaces, right? Where there's almost this sort of prosperity gospel notion. Nishay had referenced that article in the Denver Post, The Spores of a Psychedelic Mushroom Industry one. Mm-hmm. And there was this really interesting quote from a mushroom grower, I think near the end, that said, if I can position myself to be a propagator, to be a cultivator who helps serve people with the mushroom, then I'm sure I'll be financially rewarded and taken care of, he said. It's like I'm getting green lights all over the place. And I think this notion of, talking with old dead family folks who had this notion of how they were being protected on their spiritual mission of driving LSD across state lines or what have you, there are really interesting narratives around what these compounds are and how they fit into things that I'm curious when I see quotes like that on the public record in mainstream news articles, sort of how even keeled the discussion within the community is about the whats and the whys of decriminalization. Why do people think that it's important? What are we going for? If we consider some of the tensions again around, are there purposes? Are there different outcomes or applications for psychedelic medicines that are or psychedelic compounds, not as medicines, but as those compounds? Like, how do we discuss this with each other? How do we reach towards decriminalization where perhaps we go for decriminalization rather than just a component of it, of a
Sure.
an access to therapy or an access?
Well, a lot of people want decriminalization for for exploring profits. It's the roots of capitalism, are trying to find these new niches, these new untapped places that are likely to get likely to expand, especially as the whole mental health angle becomes more and more accepted. This will be the corporate way, to go for mental health. But there's a lot of people who want decriminalization or loosening the laws to pursue for-profit ventures, and then you have the other people who let's decriminalize because it's the humane thing to do. It's the smart policy thing to do because this is a historical aberration that needs to be corrected. I think there's those different motivators. I think it's pretty easy to sniff out who is looking for profits and who's looking to support human rights.
Yeah, so the question is, even for the people who are on the side of human rights and access to healthcare and access to social services, they still have to contend with the influx of these capitalist actors who are going to be doing things like trying to get in early and cornering a market, or making it harder for other people to get in and to try to make it early. And a lot of times the people who get in early are the people who have the social and financial capital to establish a foothold during risky times, which tends to be, white, wealthy people who have access to those kinds of things to get started. And so even if we are just on the side, just for example, if we're in favor of decrim because jail is not the place to deal with drugs and drug addictions and drug problems, if that is our angle, we still have to deal with the reality of the fact that certain ways of going about it can create an opening for these other actors to come in.
Sure, which I think speaks to the general void of advocacy groups pushing for decrim that falls on the human rights side. The people who are funding these initiatives need to demand that human rights are probably take precedence over opening these markets up for other actors.
Well, and sticking with Nishé's point about us needing to sort of sort through things just on the side, of folks who are on the side of human rights or keeping people out of jail more generally, there's questions about, and going back to her earlier statement about, I don't want my project to succeed based on kicking somebody else or pulling the support structures out from somebody else just because I think that my effort makes more sense. I'm curious if we wind up with segments that are perhaps interested in, say, decriminalization for spiritual use or decriminalization for medical use or therapeutic use or what have you, or if we're talking about decriminalization for any sort of specified ends rather than decriminalization full stop. Is there a way to create coalitions that can support each other in those messages rather than competing with each other? I mean, thinking about groups like the DPA, Drug Policy Alliance, I would imagine that they would be natural allies, even if I would imagine that there have to be groups that can, if everything gets rooted through them, but that would seem to offer some extension. And I would suspect one of the Bryans can speak to some of that.
Well, the great Seth Bachman said, you don't have to fuck people over to survive. And so when we're talking about these kinds of strategic issues, I think it's great if we decriminalize things piecemeal, because that's what we can get accomplished now. I'm for it. Okay. But as we said earlier, I start some talks that I give publicly by saying, look, we're going to talk about microdosing today. We're going to talk about, ayahuasca or something. But let's be clear, I support the decriminalization of all substances, and the drug war is a racial project. So let's just get that out there, and then we can move on to whatever, strategic thing we're working on right now. I don't believe that these exceptionalist efforts are mutually exclusive with broad decriminalization efforts, just as I don't think that medicalization as a strategy precludes efforts at the ballot box. I think we should all be rowing in the same direction. And unfortunately, I'm not sure that everybody, really is down for that particular big tent approach, but that's where I'm at.
Well, the idea of the Big Ten differs between people, because that
Yes.
rowing in the same direction quote made me think of certain people who have gone after Dave, for example, and said, he's the one by causing trouble who's rowing in the other direction. And from my perspective, that's not. It's the attempt to coerce people into this normative medical approach. That's the rowing against the direction. So it's one thing to say we should all be working together, and then it's another thing to say this is what that working together is and what it looks like.
Yeah, good luck hurting those weird cats. So I wanted to talk a little bit about sort of this unfolding situation with the Oregon Psilocybin Society. So they were originally leading a decriminalize mushroom effort, and we will see what that evolves into in 2020, but currently the decriminalization language is no longer a part of that effort. So essentially, this is something that This is something that is it's moving forward, and we'll see what happens at the ballot box. But we're having conversations that eventually will get to the state level. And essentially, if we expect to win, we have to, do the all politics as local thing, and then find allies at the state level, and then eventually get other states on board and finally work at the federal level. I think that's the grassroots model. I think the medical model that is out there is that we should, interface with the FDA and we can get all this done without a single vote passed. But I don't think these are mutually exclusive strategies. But yeah, we'll see what's happening in Oregon. But they have a therapeutic model. We're going to get into this more in depth in our medicalization effort, I think, because right now, as it stands, the current legislature, as it's written, or the current legislation as it's written in Oregon, is covering a therapeutic model that no longer has decriminalization on the table.
And I think there's really interesting dynamics around that, both as far as how it's changed to that, and also to what degree people may feel like, because we're talking a state level here compared to Denver or Oakland, or even seeing what happens in Berkeley or wherever else, where the amount of resources and the number of people needed to help push things through, to engage, to help collect signatures, the funding questions around that, all of these things come together in ways where I could imagine, not being on the ground or involved in that that in looking at the state level, it may feel a lot more like a winner take all sort of where it's harder to see some of those opportunities for coalitions, where if something that is now seen as therapeutic rather than, say, a full or a pure decrim is coming in, I wonder if people have questions whether or not those therapeutically minded folks will be willing or able to help hold the door open for other measures, to what degree we can see that sort of cross-pollination and additional support. And it feels easy for me to say this as somebody who has been quite open about some of my anti-institutional sentiments, but to what degree, as we see decrim organizations pop up as nonprofits or as little clusters of interested and like-minded folks, to what degree do we see people put more faith or sort of effort into their own projects, and how do those projects compare? How does the focus on the individual project or organization compare to that broader project of decriminalization, whether in a coalition sense or otherwise? And I don't have answers for this. I just think it'll be interesting to keep an eye on the terrain. And maybe, we might find that we have to remind each other and other folks in these communities, at least to examine their motivations, to question what they're getting into, for all of us to sort of keep each other honest, right? Ask ourselves and each other to check our guts and to check our thoughts and find the blind spots, because I know I've got them. I figure we all do.
Well, I think this is where, having honest and open clarifications of people's ethics that's where it's very important. I mean, we were talking a moment ago about how pretty quickly you can sniff out people who are trying to protect whatever business model that they're pushing, and those who unequivocally can say, no, we're talking about human freedom and reducing suffering and ending, really vastly unjust systems of violence. I mean, and there are those who really can say all of that, and they're still going to try and protect their business model. But, you were just saying we need to hold each other accountable. Well, this is how we do it. We have players on the record clarifying what it is that they actually stand for, and we go from there.
And some of that telling, sniffing out involves giving people time. Because like with sociopaths who can fake empathy for a while, but then their true colors show, sometimes you need to be around people for a while and see an organization for a while to get a feeling of what their true intentions are. And so that's just, one of the reasons why when these mysterious actors pop up with mysteriously vast sources of funding, it's worth saying like, maybe we should not just open-heartedly embrace these folks, but be a little bit cautious and ask the questions, keep an eye on it.
Preach.
Yeah. How many people embraced Compass Pathways as a nonprofit operation only to get knifed in the back when they went for profit? I mean, we've seen this happen, I would say, repeatedly. And so I think this is the moment, as we see things starting to tip over, as we see numerous venture capital funds starting to really greedily eye the psychedelic marketplaces and identify them as virgin markets. And some of the write-ups from some of these people are really disturbing. And I think understanding where the money is coming from and what the influence, and knowing that we'll never fully know what someone's motivations are. I think Nishé's dead on in that we need to give them that time, or at least enough time, perhaps in a sort of incubated or isolated or walled off space, to get a sense of what's actually going on here.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of interesting things that are coming out. I think that, we do have a lot of reasons to, be hopeful, but to not just hope and sit on our hands. I think the reality is that I think we did see a missed opportunity to be talking on a national stage with some of the most progressive candidates that we've seen in decades, to have a conversation that, was substantive about, the drug war generally, and not simply the fact that white people are dying from opiates now, and we need to, be sensitive to people who use drugs now. I think that to see that narrative change, we're going to have to see people speaking clearly and advocating for people who use drugs, which in my assessment, I believe, is everyone. I mean, whether we're, here's these distinctions that are essentially legally invented. It's always been baffling to me that heroin and methamphetamine are Schedule II drugs, but cannabis and mushrooms and LSD are Schedule I. You can be prescribed heroin in the hospital. I think it's called dimorphine. You can have a dimorphine drip right there. And I mean, morphine is effectively heroin, just not about three times less strong. So all of these derivatives that are out there, we're comfortable saying, oh, well, this is exactly like methamphetamine, and it's your narcolepsy prescription. So this is useful, but when it's on the street, this is a class indicator that says that you're somebody that I don't have to care about.
Yeah.
Well, politicians will respond once the public takes its head out of its ass as far as understanding of drugs.
Well, this gets back to the whole white nationalism kind of crisis that we're facing politically in this country, because that Nixon, when he was getting into his war on drugs, he had a commission that went out and tried to, you know, figure out the danger of drugs. And that commission came back and said, the drugs aren't the problem. The problem is the underfunding of services and the, you know, strategic isolation of different, you know, groups into slums and et cetera. And he had that report and he basically tossed it in the trash. And it's just easy. It's easy to apply to that kind of like id group mentality of us versus them, the bad brown people coming across the border with the drugs, than it is to have a, you know, institute a systematic, you know, social services and all of these other forms of education and access to means of survival and safe housing and safe water.
It's very easily exploitable by politicians. What Trump is doing has been done for over 100 years. You attach a substance with an immigrant population who are perceived to be stealing their jobs. It's happened with Asians. It's happened with blacks during migration to the north and to the west. It's happened with Mexicans.
It happened with colonization. I mean, this yes. In some ways, we could argue, you know, this is the effect of empires. You need to establish control by eliminating, you know, different forms of worship and religion.
Similarly with empire, we see re-education, right? So it's not as much as I would love if it was simple as, hey, public, pull your head out of your ass. It's also like when we look at the sort of education that's being implemented around substances, around substance use, around harm reduction, or really the amount of education that's not being implemented. There are huge holes, and I know we've all talked about the importance of education. And I think if we're going to talk about decriminalization as a way forward, there needs to be a sort of core tenet of education, of sane, sensible, reasonable education.
And not abstinence-only drug education.
Absolutely not.
That's kind of an oxymoron.
Always.
I mean, the point taken is to me is that abstinence only thing. I've often said that, you know, the topic of drug use is very similar to the topic of sex. If you want, you can just talk about all the syphilis that you can get from sex. But I prefer, you know, talking about orgasms. I mean, you can be talking about harm reduction, but we could also be talking about pleasure production, and that is a full spectrum drug education.
Can't talk about pleasure in the United States. There's no pleasure.
I think we will eventually. I think we're going to talk a little bit about that. But
you can say benefit maximization. I
like that one.
Oh, there's our puritanical buzzword.
Or the betterment of well people.
There we go. Yeah. Well, I think that we've covered a lot of what we set out to talk about today. I think I'm really looking forward to future episodes where we dig into other sticky topics. And I think one of the things that